All right, so we're diving into fantasy films today. Specifically, that thing everyone always talks about. Why do so many adaptations just completely flop? And we've got a ton of sources to dig through on this, like YouTubers breaking down these failed franchises, writers spilling behind-the-scenes secrets, even some interesting ideas about how Game of Thrones might have, changed the entire landscape. Yeah, Game of Thrones is a whole other beast. It feels like there's always this back and forth, between, staying faithful to the book versus actually making a good movie. But maybe that's the problem in the first place. So to make sense of all of this, I've got an expert here with me to help us sift through all these opinions and especially connect the dots between some pretty conflicting views from these different YouTubers. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, so one of the most surprising arguments I found was from Sammy and Books, who basically say flat out that demanding a faithful adaptation is a terrible idea.
Oh, wow.
I know. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Don't we all want the book, perfectly recreated on screen?
Well, it's understandable to want that. But honestly, books and film, they're just different beasts. It's like expecting a symphony to capture the exact same feeling as a painting. They just work with different tools and they reach the audience in different ways.
Yeah, it's like trying to make a photograph.
Yeah.
Capture the feeling of a dream. Which doesn't translate.
Exactly. And Sammy and Books, they have this really simple example. Imagine that line, "It was raining fire." In a book that's super vivid, super easy, but in a film...
That's your entire special effects budget right there.
Right. You suddenly have stunt people, set design, safety regulations, A single line becomes this huge, massive undertaking.
Yeah.
And so imagine trying to recreate a whole fantasy novel with all of the complex magic systems, all these fantastical creatures, and you have a normal film budget.
It'd be a nightmare. Logistically, financially, all of it.
Yeah.
But Sammy and Books make this point that goes way beyond just the practical stuff. They say good adaptations are about creative translation, not just blindly copying everything. It's about finding the soul of the story and figuring out how to express that in the language of film.
That's it. And sometimes that means making changes, which, I get it, can be tough for fans to swallow. But those changes, when they're done well, can be the difference between a decent adaptation and something truly special.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that actually makes me think about something Center Row brings up, which is always a good chuckle. Studio interference. They have this hilarious story about the writers for Herbie Fully Loaded being forced to add all of these goofy gags.
It's easy to just laugh that off as just, a silly kids movie. But studio interference is a huge problem across Hollywood, and it can absolutely destroy even the most promising projects.
Yeah, it's like having this master chef carefully crafting this complex dish, and then some studio exec just bursts in and dumps a whole bag of sugar in it.
Exactly. And that can happen even with a passionate director. You have a talented team, everyone is great, but then one out-of-touch executive who just doesn't get the source material at all can just completely throw a wrench in the whole thing.
And it feels like that happens even more with fantasy adaptation. The things that draw us to those stories, the intricate world building, the morally great characters, that stuff can get lost when studios are just chasing mass appeal.
It's true. And it brings us to another major point that a lot of the sources bring up.
Time. Yep. Movies are just limited in a way that books aren't. They don't have the space to do these sprawling fantasy worlds justice. Imagine cramming The Lord of the Rings into a single 2-hour film. I don't even think it's possible.
You lose so much essential plot, character development, those quiet moments that make the world feel real, the audience completely lost.
Yeah, totally lost.
But as the thrifty typewriter points out, something interesting has happened. The rise of prestige TV.
Now, here's where things get really interesting. Could it be that the success of shows like Game of Thrones has actually pushed studios towards TV as the go-to for fantasy?
That's a really good question.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Because suddenly there's time to breathe life into these worlds, to show the characters evolving over time, to have these epic battles feel earned.
Right. It's not just action.
And look, it's not a coincidence that so many failed fantasy films are being rebooted as TV shows. Percy Jackson, The Golden Compass, The Spider-Wick Chronicles, almost as if the studios are realizing maybe they had the right stories all along, just the wrong format.
You might be onto something there. It does seem like giving these stories the space to unfold naturally makes for a way more satisfying experience for the audience.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But, you kind of hinted at something earlier. It's not just about having more time, is it? You're right. There's a deeper issue here. And Center Row, their analysis really gets to the heart of it. Novels, video games, even stage plays, they all have these unique narrative structures that don't always fit neatly into that three-act structure of film.
Yeah, trying to force them is like
Yeah.
shoving a square peg in a round hole. It's just not going to work.
It's not. Think of it this way. A stage play might have two people just talking for hours, and it's completely captivating. But try putting that on screen.
Oh, I fell asleep.
Exactly. You know, this is something you, the listener, can probably relate to. It's like listening to a podcast at 2x speed.
Oh, yeah. You get the information.
But you miss all the nuance, all the emotional impact.
Oh, I'm so guilty of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm all about efficiency. But you're right. Sometimes you need to slow down, savor the experience.
Exactly. And that's what a good adaptation understands. It's not just about hitting all the plot points. It's about finding a way to translate the tone, the feel, the soul of the work into a new form.
And I imagine that challenge gets even harder when you're dealing with anime adaptations. C.A. Domate makes this great point about how censorship can absolutely gut these adaptations.
It's true. Like, you're trying to take something so vibrant and complex and force it into this tiny, plain box.
It's like they're sucking the life out of it. Their example is the 4Kids version of One Piece, where they literally replaced violence with lollipops.
Oh, come on. I know.
It's ridiculous. But it highlights this bigger issue. With adapting any visual medium, really, you lose that interactivity. You're no longer the hero making choices, overcoming challenges. You're just watching from the sidelines.
Which can be a huge bummer for fans who love being immersed in that world.
Totally.
And speaking of capturing a specific feel, Michael Bancroft's take on the Sandman adaptation illustrates something super important. Tone matters.
It really does.
A lot. His critique is pretty brutal. He basically says the adaptation is so focused on being woke that it sacrifices the escapism and that dreamlike atmosphere that made the comics so special. Yeah, and it's a big question for the listener. What do you value most in an adaptation? Is it sticking to the source material no matter what? Or is it about capturing the heart and soul of the original, even if it means making some change?
It's a tough question because, as Bancroft argued, when adaptations prioritize an agenda over capturing the true essence of a story, they often lose what made the original so captivating in the first place.
It happens all the time, and it's a shame.
Now, you know it's not all doom and gloom. There are glimmers of hope in these sources, films that got it right.
Oh, tell me about it. Like The Lord of the Rings.
The Lord of the Rings, yep.
How to Train Your Dragon.
Yeah.
Even The Godfather. What's fascinating is that all of these successful adaptations, they come from such different source material. But they all seem to understand this key principle, knowing what is absolutely essential to the story and finding a way to express that in this new form.
It's about making those smart choices.
It is.
So if you were tasked with adapting your favorite fantasy book into a film,
Ooh, that's a good question.
what would you prioritize? Would you be a stickler for every single detail? Or would you be willing to make some bold choices to make sure the story really shined on screen?
That's a tough one. That's the question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there's a simple answer. But we can look at those successful adaptations and kind of figure out what they're doing right.
Okay, so let's break it down. What separates, like, a Lord of the Rings from, say, Aragon? What are those golden rules of adaptation?
One thing that really jumps out to me is a deep, genuine understanding of the source material. It's not just knowing the plot. It's about getting the themes, the tone, what makes the characters tick.
Yeah, it's like the difference between skimming a Wikipedia summary versus actually like losing yourself in the book.
Exactly. And that understanding, it lets filmmakers make those smart choices about what to keep, what to change, and even what to cut altogether.
From the Frame actually had this great quote about adaptation. They said, "To adapt is to destroy."
Ooh, that's intense.
I know, right? But it highlights that adaptation, it's an inherently creative act. It's not just duplication.
It's about taking something apart and rebuilding it in a new form while still honoring its spirit. And that requires a certain fearlessness.
Which brings us back to that idea that demanding a faithful adaptation can actually be a trap. Because sometimes being truly faithful to a story means being willing to deviate from the letter of the book.
Yeah, it's about having vision. Like a director like Peter Jackson. I mean, he clearly had a deep love for Tolkien's world. But he also wasn't afraid to make tough choices, like cutting Tom Bombadil or rearranging scenes.
Oh man, I bet that made some Tolkien purists see red. But ultimately, those changes, they led to a more cohesive and cinematic experience.
And that's what we're aiming for, right? An adaptation needs to work as a film, first and foremost. It can't just be a shadow of the book.
This might be why comic book adaptations tend to have a better track record.
Under the Scote actually argues that since comic book characters have been reinterpreted so many times over the years, fans are more open to seeing different versions. It's true. There's no single like definitive Batman or Superman, so there's more freedom to play with those characters and those worlds.
Less pressure to get it right because there isn't one right way.
Exactly. And that freedom can lead to some really innovative and unexpected results.
Yeah, like Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy gave us a much darker, more grounded Batman, but it totally worked.
Right. But of course, there's a flip side to that. That freedom can also lead to adaptations that lose sight of what made the original so special.
Under the Scope uses the live-action Ghost in the Shell as an example. They say it tried so hard to nail the visuals of the anime that it completely missed the soul.
It's that uncanny valley effect. It's close enough to be recognizable, but off enough to be unsettling.
So what's the secret sauce? Is there a magic formula for making a good adaptation?
I wish it were that simple. There's no guaranteed recipe for success. But looking at these examples, a few key things emerge. Deep respect for the source material, a willingness to make tough choices, and a solid understanding of what film does well as a...
But at the end of the day, I think it comes down to passion. When the filmmakers truly care about the story, it shows.
Couldn't agree more. There's a huge difference between adapting something because you think it'll be a cash cow versus adapting something because you feel like it deserves to be told in a new way.
It's that fire in the belly. Yeah. It fuels the creative process and helps you overcome all those hurdles that come with adaptation.
But let's be real, passion isn't always enough. You need talent, a skilled team, and sometimes just a bit of luck to make it in Hollywood.
Right. I mean, Setarow talked about how studio meddling can derail even the most passionate projects.
Yeah.
And From the Frame highlighted how tough it is to squeeze a complex novel into a 2-hour film.
Yeah, those are real obstacles that every adaptation has to grapple with.
Okay, you've been digging into all these sources. What stands out to you as the most common reasons fantasy adaptations stumble?
Well, besides the challenges we've already talked about, it seems like there's often a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes fantasy so appealing in the first place.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What are these filmmakers missing?
A lot of times they get so caught up in the surface level stuff, the magic, the creatures, the epic battles, that they miss the deeper themes driving.
So they're so busy building the set that they forget to tell a compelling story.
Exactly. And they fail to connect with the audience on an emotional level. We need characters we care about, stakes that feel real, otherwise it's just empty spectacle.
I think that's why so many adaptations feel hollow, even if they've got all the bells and whistles.
It's about finding that balance between spectacle and substance.
Flashback Diaries had a good point about this. They were talking about adaptations of classic novels, and they said films often try to cram in too much detail, which just ends up confusing or boring the audience.
Yeah, world building is important, but it can't come at the expense of story and character.
It's like that classic writing advice, show, don't tell.
Right. Trust the audience to fill in some of the blanks, give us glimpses of the world, hints of history and culture, but don't drown us in exposition.
Which leads to something that popped up in a few sources, the importance of tone. C.A. Domain talked about how censorship can totally neuter an anime adaptation, just robbing it of its emotional weight. And Michael Bancroft argued that the Sandman adaptation failed because it was so focused on being woke that it lost the dreamlike quality of the original.
Tone is absolutely crucial to a successful adaptation. It sets the mood, it creates the atmosphere, and it shapes how we experience the story.
And when the tone is off, the whole thing can feel out of whack.
Imagine listening to a song in the wrong. The notes are all there, but it just doesn't sound right.
So for you listening, think about your favorite fantasy adaptation. What is it about the tone that pulls you in? Is it a sense of wonder, a dark, gritty realism, something else entirely?
Understanding how tone works in a good adaptation help us appreciate the choices filmmakers for better or worse.
We've spent a lot of time on the challenges of adaptation, but there are filmmakers who seem to have cracked the code. Setarow praised How to Train Your Dragon for being a great film, even though it diverges from the books quite a bit.
It's a perfect example of taking creative liberties while staying true to the spirit of the source.
And Emily Reed's books made a similar point about Fight Club. The adaptation is actually very faithful to the book, but it also understands the power of visual storytelling. It translates the story into a cinematic language that hits even harder.
That's what we should be striving for, isn't it? Adaptations that don't just rehash the source material, but find new and exciting ways to tell the story using all the tools of cinema.
Let's be real, though. Not every adaptation is going to be a masterpiece.
Of course not. And there's room for different approaches. Some adaptations might prioritize sticking closely to the source material, while others might be more loose with it.
The important thing is that the filmmakers know what they're trying to do and make choices that serve the story.
And that they have the talent and the resources to bring their vision to life.
Because even with the best intentions, an adaptation can fall flat. if it's poorly executed.
Yeah, we've seen that happen way too often, haven't we?
Oh, yeah. The graveyard of failed fantasy adaptations is massive.
But even with all the disappointments, there are those glimmers of hope, those adaptations that manage to capture the magic and transport us to another world.
That's what keeps us coming back, right?
Yeah.
That hope that the next one might just be the one that truly does our favorite stories just.
That hope is what drives us as fans to keep exploring these new interpretations, even though we know the challenges are real.
But, sometimes those adaptations are so bad, they're entertaining in a whole different way.
Absolutely. There's a certain guilty pleasure in picking apart a truly terrible adaptation and figuring out where it all went.
It's like a car crash. You just can't look away.
Maybe so. But it also speaks to our passion for these stories. We care so much that even the bad adaptations spark these interesting conversations.
And that's what this whole deep dive is about, right? Exploring why we love fantasy, why we're drawn to these stories, and why we're so invested in seeing them adapted to film.
It's a complex and fascinating topic, and I think we've just scratched the surface.
Yeah, we haven't even touched on the unique challenges of adapting video games, which is a whole other beat, or the debate over CGI versus practical effects.
Or the trend of reimagining classic fantasy stories with more diverse casts and themes.
There's so much more to explore.
So much!
But before we go too far down the rabbit hole, let's bring it back to you, the listener. What are your biggest pet peeves when it comes to fantasy adaptation? What makes you cringe or yell at the screen?
I'd love to hear it.
Because at the end of the day, this deep dive is for you. It's about helping you understand what makes these adaptations work or not work, and how to think critically about this ever-evolving genre.
Hopefully.
It's giving you some new perspectives to consider as you keep exploring the world of fantasy on film.
For sure.
Okay, but before we wrap things up, the big question. What does the future hold for fantasy adaptation?
That's the million-dollar question. Hard to say for sure, but looking at all the trends we've talked about, I think we can at least make some educated guesses.
All right, lay it on me. What's on the horizon for us fantasy fans?
Well, I think we're going to see even more fantasy heading to television. As we've discussed, TV just has that breathing room that film does. It can really delve into these rich worlds and these complex characters.
Right, and with all these streaming services popping up, they need content.
Exactly. Which means more opportunities for fantasy adaptations.
So it's a good thing, right?
It could be. It gives creators more freedom to experiment, take risks.
So are we entering this golden age of fantasy TV?
It's definitely possible, but as with any adaptation, the quality is going to vary.
Yeah, just because it's on TV doesn't automatically make it good. I'm sure we'll still get our fair share of flops.
Oh, absolutely. But I'm optimistic. I think we'll also see more ambitious adaptation, more innovative adaptation, the kind that really push the boundaries of what we think fantasy.
I like that. Okay, so what about film? Is there still room for fantasy on the big screen?
I think so. But we might see a shift in focus. Instead of trying to adapt these huge, sprawling epics, filmmakers might turn towards smaller, more contained stories that fit better within a 2-hour runtime.
So less Lord of the Rings, more The Green Knight.
Exactly. Stories that emphasize atmosphere, character, unique visual, rather than just spectacle.
Spectacle isn't dead. We'll still have those big-budget fantasy films, but maybe they'll be more focused on original idea rather than adaptation.
That makes sense. Studios are always looking for that next big franchise, and original stories, they offer so much potential. Sequels, spin-off, all that good stuff.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener? The future of fantasy adaptations, it's wide open.
It really is.
We're going to see more experimentation, more diversity, more stories that challenge our expectations.
Yeah.
But we're also going to see more flops, more missed opportunities.
That's just part of the process.
And that's okay. Adaptation is this conversation, this ongoing dialogue between creators and fans and different mediums.
I like that.
And we're all part of that conversation. Every time we watch an adaptation, we're adding to that dialogue. We're sharing our thoughts. We're shaping the future of the genre.
That's a good point.
It reminds me of something we were talking about earlier. If sticking rigidly to the source material isn't always the answer, then what does a successful future for fantasy films really look like?
It really feels like we're at this turning. Audiences are hungry for fantasy, but they're also getting smarter. They're tired of the same old tropes, those lazy adaptations. They want something fresh, something that respects their intelligence.
And I think that's where the real potential is. Instead of trying to force fantasy into the mold of a typical Hollywood blockbuster, we need to embrace what makes it unique.
Absolutely.
The world building, the complex characters, the exploration of these timeless themes.
That's all.
Exactly. And we need to trust the filmmakers who understand how to bring those elements to life on screen.
More of that, for sure.
We need more directors like Guillermo del Toro, who can blend fantasy and reality so seamlessly, creating these worlds that are both familiar and strange.
Yes, and like Bong Joon-ho, whose film Okja showed that fantasy can tackle these serious social issues without sacrificing entertainment.
And maybe most importantly, we need to expand our idea of what fantasy can even be.
Expand it, blew it wide open.
Because it's not just elves and dragons. It's about exploring the human condition, asking these big questions, challenging our assumptions about the world.
It's a powerful genre.
And those questions can be explored in so many ways, from gritty realism to whimsical comedy, mind-bending thrillers to heart-wrenching dramas. Fantasy is a genre with endless possibilities.
I love that.
So, listener, I hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for just how complex adaptation can be.
It's a beast.
And maybe it sparked some ideas of your own. What kind of fantasy films do you want to see?
What stories are out there waiting to be told?
What worlds are waiting to be explored? Because the possibilities really are endless. It's up to all of us, creators and fans alike, to keep pushing the boundaries and create a future where fantasy on film can truly thrive.
I'm here for it.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, but as we've seen, there's always more to explore.
Always.
So keep those questions coming, keep those discussions going, and keep the passion for fantasy alive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.